Michael, with another first in American history. Donald Trump, now the first and only man who's held the presidency to face a felony conviction. There you see the verdict sheet filled out by a New York jury of 7 men and 5 women, guilty on all 34 felony counts of falsifying business records as part of an illegal scheme to corrupt the 2016 election that made him president. This is the third time this year that citizen jurors have held Trump accountable. In January, an $83.3 million judgment for defaming E. Jean Carroll. In February, a $450 million judgment for civil fraud in his business dealings. Juries, ordinary people doing their duty under enormous stress, demonstrating civic courage. Remarkably, convicted felons can run for president. So this year, in this extraordinary time, American voters will be the ultimate jurors. We're going to cover all the fallout of this unprecedented event. We start with Aaron Katersky at the courthouse in Manhattan. Good morning, Aaron.
George, good morning to you. This was an extraordinary trial, and it is unlike any other in American history. We are expecting to hear from former President Trump today here at Trump Tower after a guilty verdict that will now echo throughout this year's presidential election. This morning, Donald Trump is a convicted felon. A jury of 12 New Yorkers found the former president and presumptive Republican nominee guilty as charged of all 34 counts. The historic verdict marks the first time a former president has been convicted of a crime. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg said he simply did his job.
While this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law and doing so without fear or favor.
After 5 weeks of gripping testimony from 22 witnesses, the jury convicted Trump of falsifying business records so voters wouldn't find out he paid hush money to adult film actress Stormy Daniels.
It's a culmination of a lot of the pressure that she's been under the last few years and the assault really in the social media realm upon her, and just the fear of going through something like this and then coming to court and testifying for 2 days. There's a lot of emotion.
The payment to Daniels was meant to silence her claim of a sexual encounter with Trump. He denied the tryst, but prosecutors said he feared the story would sink his 2016 presidential campaign. They called it the subversion of democracy. The jury deliberated nearly 10 hours over 2 days and seemed prepared to go home before a dramatic turn in the courtroom. Judge Juan Merchan was preparing to dismiss the jury for the day. Then jurors signaled they had reached a verdict. Trump, who had been joking and laughing with defense attorney Todd Blanche, suddenly rigid, stone-faced, looking down as the jury read the verdict count by count. It took 2 minutes. Trump shut his eyes and shook his head, and he lashed out as he left court.
It's just a disgrace, and we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end, and we'll win.
Trump and his allies cast doubt on his conviction, harnessing Trump's political power and his grip on the Republican Party to rally supporters around calls for retaliation ahead of the election this fall.
The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
Outside court, the stunning conviction became a moment of celebration. And star witness Michael Cohen, who the defense called the greatest liar of all time, hailed what he called an important day for accountability and the rule of law. Cohen saying the truth always matters. Trump's lawyers said there will be an appeal.
As soon as we can appeal, we will. And the process in New York is there's a sentencing, and then we appeal from there.
The sentencing hearing is coming up on July 11th. That's just days before the Republican National Convention. George, the former president, faces up to 4 years in prison. George.
Aaron Katersky, thanks. We are joined now by the star witness, Michael Cohen. Michael, thanks for coming back.
Good to see you, George.
GMA. You were here with us, sitting in that chair in March 2023. You predicted this outcome, so you're not surprised.
No, I'm not. In fact, next month, George, is when you and I sat down for that historic change in my life. That was July 1st. Of 2018, 6 years ago, when I turned around and I told you that my wife, my daughter, my son, and my country have my first loyalty. And this has been one heck of a journey in order to keep it.
One heck of a journey. How about that time in the courtroom? What was the toughest moment for you?
I really didn't have a single moment that was tougher than the 21 hours that they had me on the stand, whether it was on direct or on cross-examination. The whole thing was very tough. It's emotionally draining because You have to be perfect. I knew that any mistake that I made would be just, it would become the topic of conversation that would just explode. And so I really just needed to stay focused. And it wasn't easy with Todd Blanche. He's a meanderer as it goes to questioning.
He called you the greatest liar of all time. You've been convicted for lying. Are you done lying?
Yeah, you know, I want people to also remember, I take responsibility for what I did. But remember that the lie, we have to remember what it was. It was the number of times that I claimed to have spoken to Donald about the failed Trump Tower Moscow project. I stated 3 versus 10. I shouldn't have done it, but I did it in coordination and at the direction of Donald, Jay Sekulow, Ivanka, Jared, Abilol, Ty Cobb. There was a whole group of people involved in the creation of that document. Now, I don't ignore my responsibility. I accepted it and in part went to prison for it. But I don't want people to think, you know, just because you lied about that, I didn't really think it was all that material, but I took responsibility for it.
And you're done now?
Absolutely done.
Did you have any moments in the courtroom where you actually had some kind of contact, communication with Donald Trump?
Only once. The rest of the time, he had his eyes closed. He was slumped back, not sure whether he was sleeping or just resting his eyes, as he would say. But there was very limited interaction. Not to mention, where you sit, it's very difficult to see the defendant the way that the judge's box versus the witness box to see the defendant, who's more to the right. I had a better view to the left of me of the jury than I did of Donald.
I'm just wondering what that was like for you. You spent years fighting for Donald Trump, bullying people for Donald Trump, even lying, as you just said, for Donald Trump in coordination with his people. Do you wish you'd never met him?
I do. I do. This has been enormously difficult on my family more than anything. It's been hard on me, but as hard as it is on me, watching my family suffer as a direct result of my actions and the misloyalty that I gave to Donald, it's something that haunts me every day.
So how did you feel when you heard that first guilty?
I let out just a gasp of air. I can't, 6 years. Remember the first time that I met with the District Attorney of New York's people, I was a prisoner in Otisville. I was in my greens. And they came back 2 more times after that. 3 times I met with DAs for New York while I was at Otisville. So this has been a long time coming for accountability.
As you know, there are a lot of Republican office holders out here, including the Speaker of the House, who are saying this is a disgrace. They're still backing Donald Trump. What's your message to Republican politicians and voters who are still considering voting for Donald Trump for president?
I'm not sure how it makes any sense. This is not just now a felon, convict, but it's also a man who has openly stated he wants to rewrite the Constitution on day one. He wants to be a dictator. Not my words, his words. He wants to destroy our tripartite system of government. He wants to get rid of the judiciary and the legislative branch and confer all power to the executive branch, meaning himself, turning himself into a king, a monarch. This country for 259 years has followed one simple principle, democracy, based on the Constitution. He wants to rewrite it as if he could. It's just terrible. So how it is that he's still even in the running, why anybody would want to vote for somebody who is anti-democratic makes no sense to me.
So the verdict is in, start of a new chapter for you?
I have to figure it out. I'm really not even sure where to go. Don't forget, it's another year before I can even reapply for my law license. My business, I've lost. You know, banks, very difficult to work with. They certainly don't make it easy for people coming out to reintegrate into society. I'm a little bit more fortunate than the average, but it's still difficult nonetheless.
Thank you for coming in today.
Great to see you again, George.
Michael?
All right, thank you, George. Let's go now to Chief White House Correspondent Mary Bruce. And Mary, the president has not commented on the verdict.
Yeah, Michael, he has not. The president himself has not weighed in on this, but his campaign says this shows that no one is above the law. They are, though, trying to walk a fine line. Obviously, they want to take advantage of this politically, but the Biden campaign has also been careful not to celebrate this too much. They don't want to feed into Trump's baseless narrative that this was all somehow orchestrated by the president. Instead, the Biden campaign is hammering the point that while Donald Trump may be a convicted felon, he can still win in November. The campaign, in a somber, somewhat muted statement, saying today's verdict does not change the fact that there is still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, saying it is at the ballot box. Adding convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. Now, don't expect the Biden campaign to completely upend its messaging because of this. I'm told they're going to continue to focus on what is at stake in this election, highlighting abortion rights and the threat to democracy. The big question now is just how much will President Biden and his campaign lean in to Trump's conviction? Biden has stayed largely silent on this trial. He is expected to comment on the verdict at some point. Michael, he is back at the White House this morning. We'll see if he takes our questions.
And we know you'll be covering it for us. Mary Bruce, thank you so much for that. And one of the big questions, what will the verdict mean to voters? Our political director, Rick Klein, joined us now. Good morning, Rick.
Yeah, good morning, Michael. This was a long trial with a lot of embarrassing developments for Donald Trump. But if anything, Donald Trump is stronger now than he was at the start of the trial. You see this very narrow lead that's been pretty persistent, Donald Trump leading by about 2 points as of now. But that said, there are Trump voters who have said that a verdict in this matter would make a big difference. This was from our poll from a couple of weeks ago. We saw 80% of Trump's supporters say they would continue to support him no matter what. But that's another 20% total that would either reconsider or withdraw their support based on a conviction. That's 1 in 5 Trump voters, which is an enormous number in an election that is expected to be as close as this one. And here's just one example of how that plays out in practice. This is a poll from just a couple of weeks ago. Like many other polls, a narrow Trump lead if you just ask the straight head-to-head, 44-40. But if you add that condition, you ask people, what if he's convicted? You see Trump support dropping by 5 points, Biden's growing by 3 points, a much different race suddenly if you talk about a conviction. The bottom line is we are in uncharted territory. There is really no precedent for this. And we've talked to some voters, undecided voters, who say they're more firmly in Biden's camp, even some who say this is pushing them toward Trump. But we're not going to know. And the bottom line is in an election this close, everything can matter. This clearly could be a huge development. George?
Okay, Rick, thanks. It's Chief Legal Analyst Dan Abrams and Rachel Scott, who's covering the Trump campaign. Dan, let me begin with you. Walk us through what kind of sentence Donald Trump will be facing.
Anything from no time to up to 4 years. We hear the term 34 counts. Yes, it's true. But effectively for sentencing, that's 1 count. It would all be served concurrently at the same time. There's no way this would be happening consecutively. The real question is going to be, even if there is no jail time, which most people expect no jail time.
First-time offender.
Correct. Low-level felony, lowest level in New York State. But the question becomes, okay, what about the possibility of home confinement? What about the possibility of community service? What about the possibility of probation? And question 2 is, when would it be served? And it would likely happen after all the appeals have been exhausted.
One other question on that. In Florida, convicted felons cannot vote until after they serve their sentence, but there's a quirk in the New York law that will allow Donald Trump to vote in this election?
Right, because Florida law defers to the place where the conviction occurred. The conviction occurred in New York, so New York law applies. And in New York, the only way you can't vote is if you are a felon currently serving time in prison, so it won't prevent him from voting.
And Rachel, remarkably and yet predictably, Republican politicians falling in line to support a convicted felon.
Donald Trump has a very tight grip on the Republican Party, and the indictments didn't really matter for most of the Republican Party. Neither does this conviction on all counts in this case. The Speaker of the House is second in line to the presidency, who showed up outside of that Manhattan courthouse to show support for the former president, called this a shameful day, saying this was a political exercise, not a legal one. Even some of Trump's toughest critics in the past, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, his former rival, who once said the indictment sucked out the oxygen out of the Republican primary, he blasted this verdict, as did Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who we know has a very icy relationship with Donald Trump. In a lot of ways, George, the Republican Party is now closer to the former president even after this guilty verdict.
What do we know about what Trump is going to do next?
You know, look, the reality is that the playbook for Trump remains the same. It doesn't really matter what exactly the verdict was going to going to be. The Trump campaign was going to fundraise off of this. He was going to use it as a rallying cry. But for a lot of Trump's advisors, this was something that was unthinkable a year ago. The idea that this case would even be brought to daylight, the idea that not alone did he be convicted on all 34 counts, Donald Trump is now faced with something we have never seen before in American history. He is going to be campaigning as a convicted felon. And the question now, how does that settle with the American voters?
Completely uncharted waters. Thank you both very much. Rebecca?
All right, George.